My name is Victor Calloway. I'm 67 years old. At my son's first wedding anniversary party, my daughter-in-law's father took me by the arm, guided me toward the back of the ballroom, and politely suggested I sit with the catering crew. His voice was calm, almost courteous, like he was correcting someone who didn't know where he belonged. 18 minutes later, one of the most powerful businessmen in 3 states rose from his chair, pointed straight at me, and asked loud enough for every guest to hear, "Do any of you have the slightest idea who that man is?" Before I tell you what happened next, hit the like button, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd like to see how far a story about dignity can travel. I spent 40 years turning Callaway Iron Works from a rented garage with 2 welders into a manufacturing and real estate empire that employed more than 1,100 people. I never built it by making noise. I built it by staying patient, paying attention, and knowing exactly when to let people discover the mistake they'd already made. My wife, Eleanor, named the company. She used to say iron was honest. It never pretended to be gold, but it lasted longer and held everything together when the pressure came. She was describing the metal, but she could have been talking about herself. Eleanor laughed at funerals because she believed grief didn't need a performance. She wore the same winter coat for 12 years because it still did its job. She never cared about appearances when substance was enough. You don't realize someone has become the center of your world until one morning you wake up and their side of the bed stays cold forever. Cancer took her 3 years before that anniversary party. 8 months later, I sold the operating side of the business. It wasn't about the money. I simply couldn't keep walking into a company that had been built with her beside me. I kept everything else, the industrial properties, the warehouses, the commercial land, and the 2 downtown office towers we'd developed together back in the 90s. Every asset was transferred into the Ironwood Legacy Trust on the advice of my attorney, Margaret Cole, who had spent decades protecting my business and could spot a legal weakness before anyone else knew it existed. The trust was irrevocable, and I remained its administrator. It paid me a comfortable monthly income, enough to live well without leaving any public trail that connected Victor Calloway to real wealth. After Eleanor died, I moved into the small Cape Cod house she'd inherited from her mother instead of staying in the estate we'd shared. It had 2 bedrooms, a vegetable garden out back, and a front porch where Eleanor spent every Sunday morning reading with a cup of coffee in her hands. It was a good neighborhood, just not an expensive one. I drove a 7-year-old Buick because it still ran like new. Eleanor used to joke that a man shouldn't replace his car more often than his principles, and I never forgot it. Most days I wore faded work shirts, canvas pants, and the same worn boots I'd had for years. None of it was an act. After selling the company, that was simply who I was. Eleanor believed money tempted people to become performers, and she'd spent 3 decades making sure it never changed us. After she was gone, living simply felt like the closest thing I had to keeping her beside me. My son, Daniel, was 32 when we lost her. Grief hollowed him out in ways I never expected. He had always been thoughtful, steady, the kind of man who weighed every decision. Then, 8 months after Eleanor's funeral, he met Melissa Ashford. She was striking, polished down to the smallest detail, the kind of beauty that looked expensive to maintain. Her family came from old Atlanta money, the kind that announced itself before anyone spoke. Her father, Grant Ashford, called himself a real estate developer, though I would eventually discover what that title really concealed. Her mother treated charity galas like competitive sports. Every gathering was a chance to measure someone's value, and people were quickly sorted into those worth knowing and those worth ignoring. It didn't take them long to decide which group I belonged to. Daniel married Melissa the following September. I paid only for what my son asked me to cover. He wanted me to handle the rehearsal dinner, so I quietly wrote the check, $40,000, bought the evening at the Ashford's favorite restaurant. I paid the bill without hesitation, slipped out before the speeches, and let the spotlight stay where Daniel wanted it. Looking back, the warnings had already begun. The first one seemed harmless. About a month after the engagement, Melissa casually mentioned that the house she and Daniel rented was far too small for the life she pictured. She smiled as she said it, but held my eyes just a moment longer than necessary. Daniel stared at his plate. I changed the subject. 2 weeks later, He called and asked if I could help with a down payment on a better home. The next morning, I wired them $120,000. No conditions, no repayment. Just a gift. Exactly as Eleanor would have done. 3 weeks passed without a word from Melissa. Then she called, thanked me warmly, and within minutes explained that the new house desperately needed renovations. She'd already spoken with an interior designer, and the kitchen and primary suite alone would cost nearly $80,000. She wanted to know what I thought. I told her I'd consider it. 2 weeks later, I mailed Daniel another check, this one for $40,000, with a short note telling them to use it however they wished. That was how it started, not with outrageous demands, but with polite requests that sounded completely reasonable until they began piling up faster than anyone noticed. Over the next several months, the requests stopped being about necessities and started becoming about appearances. Melissa needed a designer wardrobe to fit the social circles they were entering. Daniel needed a luxury car that matched his new position at the firm, a job he'd landed through Grant Ashford's connections. Then came the country club membership that was supposedly essential for networking. After that, there was a luxury vacation because everyone important at the office was going, and skipping it would send the wrong message. Somewhere along the way, I realized my son no longer called just to hear my voice. Every conversation eventually arrived at a request. What troubled me even more was how our relationship had begun to change. The easy warmth we'd shared for decades, the bond that had survived his teenage years, Eleanor's illness, and the quiet grief that followed her death was slowly disappearing. It wasn't hostility. It was something colder. Every conversation felt a little more transactional than the last. Grant Ashford, on the other hand, never bothered to hide who he was. He carried himself like a man accustomed to getting his way simply because of the size of his bank account. He insisted on calling me Chief, always with a smile that sounded friendly but somehow managed to put me beneath him. Early on, he asked about my business. I told him I'd sold the operating company and was living comfortably from the proceeds. He gave a slow nod, the kind people use when they've quietly decided you're less important than they expected. After that, he never asked another question about my work. I became background furniture present, tolerated, and largely ignored. The anniversary party was Melissa's vision and Grant's production. Their first year of marriage wasn't just something they wanted to celebrate. It was something they wanted to display. They rented the Meridian Club, a private venue inside one of downtown's newest luxury towers. Everything about the place screamed money, but very little of it suggested taste. Nearly 200 guests filled the room, most of them Ashford, relatives, developers, investors, and business contacts Grant had spent years collecting. Daniel had fewer than 40 people there, who truly belonged to his side of the family. My invitation arrived only 6 days before the event, noticeably later than everyone else's. It was typed instead of handwritten. I noticed both details and kept them to myself. That evening, I wore a crisp Oxford shirt, dark trousers, and the leather shoes Eleanor had given me on our 30th anniversary. They still looked nearly new because I'd always believed that if something mattered, you took care of it. I drove myself and arrived alone. Daniel had specifically asked me not to bring a gift, saying they already had everything they needed. I suspected those words belonged to Melissa. Throughout their first year together, she'd made it clear that my gifts were either too practical or too unusual for her taste. Inside, the room buzzed with polished conversations and practiced laughter. Crystal chandeliers reflected off marble floors. A jazz quartet played softly in the corner while servers floated through the crowd balancing champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. Everything about the evening felt carefully staged, as if every guest had come to perform success rather than celebrate love. I found Daniel standing near the bar. He smiled when he saw me, wrapped me in a hug, and for just a moment, I caught a glimpse of the son I'd almost forgotten. For a brief moment, Daniel looked like the son I remembered, relaxed, relieved, genuinely happy that I'd come. Then Melissa slipped beside him, took his arm, and something changed. His smile stayed, but it looked rehearsed now. Melissa greeted me with flawless manners, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. Before our conversation had even ended, she was already scanning the room for someone more important. Daniel followed her almost without thinking, and seconds later they disappeared into a conversation I was left holding a glass of water, which suited me just fine. I found a quiet place beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and did what I'd spent most of my career doing. I watched. Grant Ashford moved through the crowd like he owned every person in it. His wife accepted compliments about the evening as though she'd been expecting them all along. Daniel laughed a little harder than usual, smiled a little longer than necessary, slowly molding himself into the version of himself their world seemed to demand. About 40 minutes later, Grant headed straight toward me. 3 business associates drifted behind him, close enough to hear every word. They weren't there by accident. They were his audience. "Victor," he said warmly, resting a firm hand on my elbow. "You know, we've got a nice setup near the service hallway. The catering supervisors take their breaks back there. I'm sure they'd enjoy having someone to talk to. Honestly, probably better conversation than this crowd." He chuckled at his own joke. "Why don't you head back there? Things get a little intense up here." His voice never rose above a polite murmur. Only the men beside him heard it. They smiled immediately. The practiced smiles of people who always laughed when the richest man in the room expected them to. I looked down at the hand gripping my arm, then back into Grant's eyes. He barely held my gaze before looking past me, already searching for his next conversation. In his mind, the matter was settled. I quietly removed his hand from my arm. I didn't argue. I didn't follow his suggestion. I simply turned back toward the window and looked out across the city lights. Grant shrugged and walked away. His companions followed, their conversation restarting before they were even out of earshot. One of them remarked that Daniel had certainly married well. The words drifted behind them like loose coins tossed onto the pavement. Daniel never saw any of it. He was laughing across the room with another group of guests. I could have walked over and told him exactly what had happened. Instead, I stayed where I was, staring out over the skyline, thinking about Eleanor. Whenever life forced me to choose what kind of man I wanted to be, she was still the voice I listened for. Eleanor believed a person's true character wasn't revealed by how they faced their enemies. It was revealed by how they responded to people who genuinely believed they were beneath them, because those were the moments when dignity had no audience at all. Eleanor used to say that real character wasn't something you displayed when people were watching. It was the choice you made when no one would ever know. She believed almost everyone deserved grace, second chances, and the benefit of the doubt. But there was one thing she never excused. She called it small cruelty, the habit of humiliating people simply because you had the power to do it. To her, that wasn't a flaw. It was a final judgment on who someone really was. In less than a minute, Grant Ashford had told me everything I needed to know about himself. I set my glass on a nearby table, pulled out my phone, and sent a text to Frank Hartley. Frank and I had spent more than 30 years competing, negotiating, and occasionally beating each other on deals across the city. We'd started out as rivals and ended up earning something far more valuable, mutual respect. I'd spotted him earlier near the bar. He'd been invited by one of Daniel's colleagues who happened to work with him on several development projects. My message contained only 3 words. "Stand by, please." Less than a minute later, my phone buzzed. "Saw what happened. Ready when you are." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, then immediately took it out again and texted Margaret Cole. Margaret rarely stopped working, even from home. I asked her to meet me at the Meridian Club within 45 minutes and bring the complete Ironwood Legacy Trust documentation, including the updated property records we'd finalized 6 months earlier. Her reply was even shorter than Frank's. "On my way." About 20 minutes later, Grant returned. This time he came alone. That told me he'd given up on being subtle. He stepped beside me and lowered his voice. "Victor, I'm just trying to be respectful here. This really isn't your crowd. Melissa and I were talking, and we thought you'd probably be more comfortable in the back, or maybe even out in the lobby for a while. Daniel knows you came. You've made your appearance. There's no reason for you to feel uncomfortable." I looked at him without saying a word for several seconds. Grant was the kind of man who expected every room to bend around his confidence. Finally, I nodded once. "I appreciate the advice, Grant." Then I turned back toward the window. I didn't move. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Being ignored was something he had very little experience with. "I'm only saying it'd make things easier," he pressed. "I know exactly what you're saying," I replied calmly. "You didn't need to repeat yourself." For the first time that evening, Uncertainty flickered across his face. He studied me for another moment, then walked away without another word. I checked my watch. Margaret would arrive in about 20 minutes. Across the room, Frank Hartley caught my eye. I walked over, and the two of us stood near the bar talking quietly, not for anyone else's benefit, but the way two men do after spending decades learning exactly who the other is. Frank didn't ask what my plan was. He already knew there was one. Frank had witnessed the entire exchange with Grant. He didn't comment on it beyond a slow shake of his head. That was enough. "When you're ready," he said quietly. "Give it another 15 minutes. I nodded. The speeches started before Margaret arrived, which wasn't part of my plan. As expected, Grant Ashford claimed the microphone first. He spoke with the polished confidence of a man who had spent years entertaining wealthy audiences. Every compliment sounded generous, yet somehow managed to remind everyone who held the influence. He praised Daniel and Melissa, spoke proudly about the future they were building, the remarkable people surrounding them, and the opportunities waiting ahead. Naturally, he made sure to mention how much his own family had contributed to all of it. He wore humility, the way some men wear expensive watches only to make sure everyone noticed. There was one thing he never mentioned: Eleanor. And there was one person he never acknowledged: me. At my own son's anniversary celebration, the groom's father had been erased from the story. Daniel noticed. I caught him looking toward me from across the room. His expression carried apology, frustration, and the quiet guilt of someone who didn't know how to fix what was happening. I held his eyes for a second, then looked away before he had to. Grant finished with a joke that sent his business friends into loud, predictable laughter. Right then, Margaret Cole walked through the front entrance. She wore a charcoal suit, reading glasses resting on top of her silver hair, and carried a slim leather briefcase tucked neatly beneath one arm. She never hurried because she never needed to. Margaret carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who always knew exactly where every fact, every signature, and every weakness was hidden. From across the room, she found me immediately. I gave a slight nod. She returned it. People near the entrance glanced over without knowing why. There was simply something about Margaret that made conversations pause. Frank Hartley rose from his chair at exactly the right moment, waiting until the applause after Grant's toast had faded and every eye was still facing the front. He didn't ask for a microphone. He didn't need one. "Excuse me," he called, his voice carrying effortlessly through the ballroom. The conversation stopped. Guests turned toward him. Grant looked over with polite curiosity. Daniel looked confused. Melissa's expression stiffened. Frank slowly raised one hand and pointed directly across the room at me. "I've been sitting here all evening," he said, wondering how many people actually know who that gentleman is. Every head turned in my direction. "That's Victor Calloway," Frank continued. "He built Calloway Iron Works from a two-man welding shop into one of the most successful manufacturing companies this state has ever seen. And if memory serves me correctly," he paused just long enough for the room to lean in, "he also developed this building we're standing in tonight." Silence swept across the ballroom. In a single sentence, the entire balance of the evening had shifted. Grant Ashford's expression changed 3 times in the space of a few seconds. First came confusion, then calculation. Finally, the unmistakable look of a man realizing he'd stepped onto ground he didn't understand. He forced out a laugh that sounded thinner than he intended. "Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration," he said. "Victor had a nice business. He's retired now. Good legacy, certainly." He wasn't correcting Frank. He was buying himself time. "There is no exaggeration," Margaret said as she stepped to my side. She spoke without raising her voice, yet every word carried across the ballroom. "My name is Margaret Cole. I'm legal counsel for the Ironwood Legacy Trust, which Mr. Calloway administers." She placed her briefcase on a nearby table, opened it with practiced precision, and removed a folder. "The Meridian Club is owned by Calloway Meridian LLC, a wholly owned subsidiary of the Ironwood Legacy Trust." She held the document up just long enough for people to recognize it without reading it, "which means this building is owned entirely by Mr. Calloway's trust. Every dollar spent on tonight's event, from the flowers to the catering, was ultimately paid into accounts belonging to that trust. She turned toward Grant. So, to be perfectly clear, the gentleman you asked to sit with, the catering staff owns, the building where your daughter's anniversary is being held. The silence that followed was unlike anything earlier that evening. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was heavy. Grant stood perfectly still. The confidence that had filled every room he'd entered all night quietly drained away. For the first time, he looked at me without pretending to be in control. I don't know what she's implying, he managed to say, though the authority had vanished from his voice. She's not implying anything, I answered calmly. She's explaining the facts. Margaret reached into her briefcase again and removed a second file, the one I'd specifically asked her to bring. She laid it on the table, turning it so the guests nearest could see the financial summary. There is another matter relevant to tonight, she said. Her tone never changed. She wasn't enjoying this. She was simply finishing the job. During the past 14 months, Mr. Calloway has transferred approximately $340,000 to his son and daughter-in-law through direct gifts and personal payments. Quiet murmurs rippled through the crowd. Margaret waited until they settled. Those transfers were made in good faith because Mr. Calloway believed both the requests and the relationship were sincere. Another pause. Then she opened the final folder. During that same period, we've also reviewed estate planning documents prepared by attorneys representing the Ashford family. This time, every eye shifted toward Grant. Those documents contain provisions designed to channel a substantial portion of any future inheritance into jointly controlled financial structures that would significantly reduce Mr. Calloway's son's independent ownership of those assets in the event of a divorce. She closed the folder and looked directly at Grant. To put it plainly, the documents your attorneys presented as routine estate planning were carefully structured to ensure the money ultimately traveled where your family wanted it to go. No one spoke. The ballroom had gone completely still. Daniel stood frozen, unable to process what he was hearing. Melissa instinctively took a small step away from him. It was barely noticeable, but I saw it. I don't know anything about those documents, she said. Her voice stayed calm. Her trembling hands told a different story. You signed them, Margaret replied. 3 months ago. The filing date is a matter of public record. Silence settled over the ballroom again. Grant turned toward his wife. She met his eyes for only a moment before looking away, the expression on her face revealing that something they had expected to remain private had suddenly become impossible to hide. Finally, Grant looked back at me. This is an ambush, he said. You came to your own son's anniversary just to humiliate us. I shook my head. I came because Daniel is my son, and Eleanor would have wanted me here. I paused. The scene began when you decided I belonged with the catering staff. Margaret quietly placed another document on the table. This one listed the complete holdings of the Ironwood Legacy Trust, 2 downtown office towers, 4 warehouse complexes, 7 mixed-use developments, and the former manufacturing campus now leased to a national logistics company. At the bottom of the page sat the most recent assessed value, just over $400 million. Margaret didn't hold the document up. She didn't need to. Mr. Calloway is not a retired man living on modest savings, she said evenly. He administers one of the largest privately held real estate trusts in this state. The fact that he chooses to live simply has never reflected the size of his assets. Confusing those two things appears to have led to several unfortunate assumptions. Grant said nothing. His face had become the expression of a man rapidly recalculating every decision he'd made over the past year. Margaret opened one final folder. As part of our routine trust management process, we also conducted a financial review of Ashford family holdings. She glanced briefly at the documents before continuing. I won't read every detail. However, Mr. Ashford's company currently has 3 properties in default, an outstanding contractor judgment exceeding $2 million, and a revolving line of credit that was frozen approximately 14 months ago. She looked directly at Grant. Coincidentally, that's also when your daughter began dating Mr. Calloway's son. No one in the room moved. This was never about joining 2 families, Margaret continued, her voice sharpening for the first time all evening. It was about finding a financial lifeline. Mr. Calloway's modest lifestyle looked like weakness. His son looked like access. Everything over the last 14 months, including tonight's celebration, helped maintain that illusion while your family searched for assets that were never available in the first place. She closed the folder with a soft click. And the Ironwood Legacy Trust is irrevocable. Mr. Calloway intentionally owns very little in his personal name. Upon his death, every asset held by the trust transfers directly to a group of charitable foundations, with the Regional Children's Hospital, established in Eleanor Calloway's name, serving as the primary beneficiary. She let the words settle before adding one final sentence. Those documents were signed 10 years ago. They cannot be amended. They cannot be challenged. There has never been an inheritance waiting for anyone who married into this family. The room remained perfectly silent. Margaret looked around once before closing her briefcase. The vault, she said quietly, was empty from the very beginning. I watched Grant Ashford's shoulders sink. In less than 5 minutes, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years. Grant Ashford looked like a man who'd just watched his future collapse in real time. His wife stared silently at the table, as if deciding whether walking away would be easier than staying another minute. The business associates who had laughed at his jokes only moments earlier had quietly backed away, creating just enough distance to make it clear they no longer wanted to be standing beside him. Daniel wasn't looking at Grant. He was looking at Melissa. Melissa wasn't looking at Daniel. Her eyes were fixed on her father. The expression on her face wasn't guilt. It was something deeper, the look of someone realizing the story she'd believed for more than a year no longer matched reality. I crossed the ballroom toward my son. Frank Hartley walked beside me for several steps before quietly falling back, giving us the privacy we both knew we needed. Daniel looked at me the way he had as a little boy after making a mistake he couldn't fix, searching my face to see whether forgiveness was still possible. It was the first completely honest expression I'd seen from him in over a year. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then the words stopped. I waited until he looked at me. "I know you didn't plan any of this," I said. "I know you were still grieving your mother, and when your life felt like it was falling apart, you reached for something that looked stable. I understand that." He remained silent. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped calling just to talk. You stopped coming by the house. Every conversation became a request, and little by little, you accepted that as normal." I paused. "Tonight, when Grant put his hand on my arm and told me to go sit with the catering staff, you never even saw it happen. I want you to ask yourself why." Daniel lowered his eyes. "I'm not here to punish you," I continued. "You're my son. I love you, and your mother would have wanted me standing in this room tonight." My voice stayed calm. "But you need to understand something. The man they believed they were marrying into never existed. Your mother and I didn't spend 40 years building our life so someone could inherit it through manipulation. We built it to outlive us and to help people who truly needed it." I waited until he met my eyes again. "What matters now isn't what happened over the past year. It's what kind of man you choose to become after tonight." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I saw something return to his face that I'd feared was gone forever. It reminded me of Eleanor. I turned toward the room before he could answer. "Margaret," I said clearly, "please make sure every member of the catering staff receives a bonus equal to twice their pay for tonight." She nodded without hesitation. "And whatever remains of this event's budget after expenses, donate it to the Eleanor Calloway Fund at the Children's Hospital." Margaret was already making notes. My part was finished. I collected my coat near the entrance. Frank was waiting by the doors. Without saying a word, he opened one for me, and together we stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the silence behind us. Frank and I stood outside overlooking the city skyline. The lights stretching across downtown reflected from buildings I'd spent decades helping put there. They shined without asking for attention, simply doing what they were built to do. Frank let out a slow breath and smiled. "I've been doing this for 40 years, he said. "I've never seen a room change sides that fast." I smiled back. It was never about embarrassing anyone. Frank nodded. He understood exactly what I meant. Several months have passed since that night. This morning I'm sitting on Eleanor's front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun climb over the garden. The tomatoes turned out especially well this year. She would have been happy about that. About 6 weeks after the anniversary party, Daniel knocked on my door. He came alone. He looked lighter somehow, like a man who'd finally stopped lying to himself. We sat on that same porch until nearly midnight. He told me everything, things I'd already suspected and things I never would have guessed. I listened without interrupting. He didn't blame anyone else. He didn't make excuses. At one point, he asked what his mother would have thought about the choices he'd made that year. I told him the truth. Eleanor would have been disappointed by some of them. She also would have been proud that he found the courage to come home and face them. Both things could be true at the same time. Our relationship isn't exactly what it used to be. Maybe it never will be. Trust doesn't return overnight. It grows back slowly, usually in a different shape than before. But what we're rebuilding now is honest, and honesty was always the foundation Eleanor believed mattered most. As for the Ashfords, I rarely think about them anymore. People who build their confidence on what they assume are other people's weaknesses usually collapse the moment those assumptions prove wrong. Grant Ashford looked at an old man in ordinary clothes and ordinary shoes and decided he understood my worth. Everything that followed grew naturally from that single mistake. Looking back, I realize I misunderstood strength for most of my life. I thought it meant carrying every burden without complaint, staying patient no matter how heavy the load became. That matters, but it isn't the whole story. Eleanor understood something I didn't. There comes a moment when patience stops being wisdom and starts becoming permission. Permission for people to believe they can mistreat you without consequence. That's when a different kind of strength is required, not anger, not revenge, just clarity. The quiet confidence to stand in front of people who've already decided who you are and let the truth speak for itself. That's the greatest gift Eleanor ever gave me. Not the company we built together, not the buildings, not the trust, not the wealth. She taught me how to remain exactly who I was, no matter what anyone else believed. I miss her every single day. But that night, standing in that ballroom, I felt her beside me in the steadiness of my voice and the certainty of my heart. And for the first time since losing her, I realized that was enough. If you've ever reached the moment when you stopped staying silent and finally stood up for yourself, tell me about it in the comments. I'd genuinely like to hear your story.